Most television shows leave behind memories that can be trusted, a scene that can be found again, a line that can be replayed, a moment that stays exactly where it was left. The Simpsons has been running since 1989, and somewhere across those thousands of episodes, the memories stopped matching the tapes. There is the family member millions are sure they saw, who was never drawn by anyone at the show. There is the escalator scene people place in the year 2000, long before it was ever made. There is the brochure in the background that an entire generation now reads as a warning. There is the newspaper headline everyone quotes, slightly wrong. There are couch gags remembered in perfect detail that never aired, and there is the episode quietly pulled from streaming, so no one can go back and check what was there. Tonight, over the next couple of hours, this video walks slowly through the Simpsons memories that refuse to match reality. Welcome to Yellowfan. Let's get started. The memory that was never there. Memory feels like the most trustworthy thing a person owns. It sits quietly in the background of every day, rarely questioned, treated like a private record that no one else can argue with. A person knows what they saw, a person knows what they heard, and for most of ordinary life, that confidence holds up well enough that it never gets tested. The trouble begins in the rare moment when the record turns out to be wrong, and not just wrong in private, but wrong in exactly the same way as the records of thousands of other people who never met. That moment has a name now, and the name did not begin with any cartoon. It began with a woman thinking about a man she had never met, sometime around 2009. Fiona Broom described herself as someone who studied strange experiences and unexplained memories. At a gathering, the conversation turned to Nelson Mandela, and she said something that felt completely ordinary to her at the time. She mentioned that she remembered Mandela dying in prison back in the 1980s. She could picture it clearly. She recalled the news coverage of his death. She remembered, or believed she remembered, scenes of mourning, and even a speech given by his widow. It was a vivid memory, the kind that feels heavier and more real, precisely because it comes with so much detail attached. None of it had happened. Nelson Mandela did not die in prison in the 1980s. He was released in 1990. He became the president of South Africa. He lived until December of 2013. Decades beyond the moment Broom was so certain she had grieved. By every record that exists in the world, her memory was simply false. What turned a single mistake into something larger was the reaction of the people around her. A lone faulty memory is not interesting. It is just a person getting something wrong, which everyone does on a daily basis without a second thought. But when Broom began describing her memory out loud, she discovered that she was not alone in it. Other people had the very same recollection, the same prison, the same decade. Some described the same news broadcasts, the same sorrow, the same sense of having lived through an event that history insists never took place. A shared error among strangers is a far stranger thing than a private one. It stops feeling like forgetting and starts feeling like a crack in something solid. Broom began writing about the experience and built a small website to collect these shared false memories, along with the theories people offered to explain them. Almost without anyone deciding it on purpose, the phenomenon acquired a name. It was easier, she later explained, to say the Mandela Effect than to keep describing a whole crowd of people who remembered a death that never occurred. The name took hold. It moved quietly from person to person, passed along by people who found it unsettling and could not quite shake it. The cleanest definition is the one worth carrying through everything that follows. A Mandela Effect is a false memory shared by a large number of people. Not one person slipping up on their own, but many people misremembering the same detail in the same direction, frequently with the same stubborn confidence, frequently holding to that memory even after the evidence sits in plain view. After the idea had a name, the examples arrived faster than anyone could organize them, and they tended to gather in the small and ordinary corners of life. Childhood was a common source. A beloved series of picture books about a family of bears, read aloud to generations of children at bedtime, is remembered by an enormous number of adults as ending in the letters E-I-N. The real spelling ends in A-I-N, and it always has. A gentle cartoon monkey, curious and round-eyed, is pictured by countless people with a long tail trailing behind him. He has never been drawn with one. The wealthy little mascot of a famous board game, the man in the top hat, lives in many minds wearing a monocle over one eye. No monocle has ever been part of his design. A well-known underwear brand is remembered by a remarkable number of people as having a small horn of plenty in its logo, a cornucopia spilling fruit. That cornucopia was never there. Film and television carried their own versions, and this is where the whole subject begins to drift closer to Springfield. The most quoted line in a certain space saga, the moment when the villain in the black helmet reveals a terrible family secret, is remembered by almost everyone as beginning with the name Luke. The character never says the name in that scene. The true line opens with the word "no." A famous command from a starship captain asking to be beamed back aboard his ship was never actually spoken in the original series in the exact form that lives in the public mind. There is even a children's comedy about a genie starring a particular comedian that millions of adults are convinced they rented and watched as kids. That film does not exist and never did, and the comedian himself has spent years gently telling people he never made it. These are the close relatives of what this video is really about. They show the shape of the thing before the cartoon ever enters the picture. A memory can feel personal, private, and unshakably true, while belonging at the same time to a whole population of strangers who are all wrong together, all in the same way, all at once. So the question underneath every example is how this happens at all. Why would the same specific mistake bloom in so many separate minds with no contact between them? The earliest people drawn to the phenomenon reached for dramatic answers. Some pointed to parallel universes, suggesting that reality had shifted and that these memories were the leftovers of a timeline that no longer exists. Others suggested travel between dimensions, or that the world had been quietly rewritten while everyone was looking the other way. These explanations are thrilling, and the thrill is a large part of why the Mandela Effect spread the way it did. A plain memory error is forgettable. A tear in reality is impossible to forget. The less exciting explanation is the one favored by people who actually study how memory works, and it is, in its own quiet way, far stranger than any parallel world. Human memory was never the dependable recording machine most people assume it to be. It does not work like a camera that captures a scene and stores it untouched in a drawer. It works more like a story the mind tells itself and then tells again, and every retelling is a chance for small edits to slip in unnoticed. Details get smoothed over. Gaps get filled with whatever seems to fit. Suggestions from other people get folded in and absorbed until they feel like first-hand experience. Over years, the story drifts from the event that first inspired it, and the person telling it has no sense that any drift has occurred. The memory feels exactly as solid as it did on the first day. Researchers have names for the separate parts of this drift. One idea holds that the mind stores memories partly through expectation, through a sense of how things ought to be rather than how they strictly were. A monkey is expected to have a tail, so the mind quietly supplies one for the tailless cartoon monkey. A board game tycoon dressed in old-fashioned wealth seems like the sort of figure who would wear a monocle, so the mind hands him one he never owned. Another idea describes a kind of honest invention where a person fills a gap in memory without any intention to lie, sincerely believing the invented piece because it arrived feeling like a fact. A third describes how new information, encountered after the event, quietly rewrites the original memory, so that a misquote heard 100 times slowly replaces the line that was actually spoken. None of these forces require a parallel universe. They only require a normal human brain doing the normal human thing of remembering imperfectly, multiplied across millions of people who all share the same expectations, the same cultural references, and the same small handful of details worth getting wrong. Now the cartoon can finally walk into the room, because few things on Earth are better built to feed this process than The Simpsons. Consider what the show actually is, stripped down to plain numbers. A yellow family that first appeared in short, scrappy form in the late 1980s, then launched as its own series in 1989, and then simply never stopped. More than 3 decades on the air. Hundreds upon hundreds of episodes. A run so long that children who grew up watching it have raised children of their own who also grew up watching it. Almost no other piece of popular entertainment has been absorbed by so many people, so casually, over so many years, in so many half-watched afternoons and reruns playing quietly in the background of family rooms. A show watched that way leaves a particular kind of memory behind. Few people sit and study an episode of The Simpsons the way they might study a film they paid close attention to. The show is something a great many people grew up half watching, soaking in while doing homework, while eating dinner, while drifting towards sleep. Memories formed in that loose, half-attentive state are soft at the edges from the very start. They were never sharp recordings. They were impressions, gathered while the mind was busy with something else, and impressions are exactly the kind of raw material that drifts. The way the show is built makes the drift worse, in the most fascinating way. The Simpsons is famous for cramming its frames with background detail. A single shot can hold a sign on a wall, a headline on a newspaper, a label on a product, a quick visual joke that flashes by in under a second and is gone before most people consciously register it. The makers buried these little gags everywhere, knowing that many would only ever be caught on a second or third viewing, or on no viewing at all. A show packed with thousands of these fleeting details, watched by hundreds of millions of half-attentive people across 30 years, is something close to a perfect machine for manufacturing false memories. There is simply so much to misremember, and so little of it was ever looked at carefully enough to be remembered right. The sheer length of the run adds another layer. When a show produces that many episodes, the line between what aired and what merely feels like it could have aired begins to blur. A joke that fits the show so perfectly that it seems like something the writers would obviously have done can lodge itself in memory as a real moment, even when no such moment exists. The audience knows the rhythm of the show so well that the mind can compose new scenes in that rhythm without realizing it has done any composing at all. A fan can be completely certain they saw something simply because it sits so comfortably inside everything else they truly did see. All of these forces point in the same direction. A vast, familiar, detail-stuffed show absorbed loosely over decades by an audience that trusts its own memory of it is bound to collect false memories the way an old coat collects loose threads. And collect them it has. The Simpsons has become, without any real competition, the single richest hunting ground for the Mandela Effect anywhere in popular culture. Characters people are sure they saw. Lines people are sure were spoken. Scenes recalled in confident detail that the tapes do not support. Predictions that feel uncanny until the dates are checked and the memory falls apart in the hand. What makes all of this worth a slow and careful look is not the conspiracy version of the story. The point is not that reality shifted or that timelines collapsed. The point is gentler and more human than that. A cartoon family, drawn in bright colors and meant mostly to make people laugh, turns out to be one of the clearest windows ever made into how unreliable human memory really is. The show did not break anyone's mind. It simply gave the ordinary failures of memory a stage large enough and familiar enough for everyone to notice them happening at the same time. That is the foundation for everything ahead. Each example in this video is a small demonstration of the same quiet truth, dressed up in yellow. And the place to begin is with the strangest case of all, the one where an entire crowd of people did not merely misremember a detail of a character, but became convinced of an entire member of the family who was never there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This first stop laid out what the Mandela Effect is, and why a show watched loosely for 30 years became the perfect place for false memories to gather. Next comes the most unsettling example of them all, a Simpsons character that countless people swear they remember. The only problem is that no one at the show ever drew him. Section 2. The Simpson who never existed somewhere on the internet. On a perfectly ordinary day, a person scrolls past an old screenshot from The Simpsons and feels a small tug of recognition. The image looks aged and slightly worn, the way a frame from an early season looks. The Simpson family is there, drawn in the familiar style, and standing among them, blending in as though he had always belonged, is a character the person cannot quite place. A pale, round-headed figure, a little stretched, a little off, but somehow familiar. A caption underneath asks why nobody seems to remember him anymore. His name, it says, is Graggle. For a great many people, that small tug of recognition was enough to start the doubt. The figure looked like he fit, the screenshot looked real, and the human mind, faced with something that fits so neatly into a world it already knows, will often reach for the gentlest available explanation, which is that the thing must have been there all along and was simply forgotten. Graggle Simpson, sometimes also called Gumbly, became one of the most talked about cases in the entire history of the Mandela Effect. Online communities argued about him with real energy. Some people insisted, with apparent sincerity, that they remembered him from childhood. Others were certain he had never existed and grew frustrated with the people who claimed otherwise. The argument spread far enough that it reached fact-checkers, who eventually had to write the sentence that, on its face, should never need writing. No character named Graggle or Gumbly has ever appeared on The Simpsons. Not once. Not in any season, not in any episode, not in any frame drawn by anyone connected to the show. The screenshots were forgeries. Every single image showing Graggle inside a Simpsons scene had been altered. The figure dropped into a real frame by someone with photo editing software and a sense of humor. He had never been animated. He had never been voiced. He had no episodes, no storylines, no place in the family tree. He was a shape pasted into old pictures, and the pictures were convincing enough that an argument grew up around them, as though they were evidence of something. The origin of the hoax can be traced with more precision than most internet mysteries allow. The figure first appeared on an anonymous image board back in October of 2015, when a user added the strange shape to a screenshot of the show and left it there. For years, almost nothing happened. The image sat quietly in a corner of the internet, the way a great deal of forgotten content does, neither spreading nor disappearing. Then, in January of 2021, a different anonymous user on a different board wrote up a backstory for the pale, stretched-out blob. They gave him a name, a history, a sense of having been part of the show, and with a backstory attached, the figure suddenly had everything he needed to travel. Travel he did. Through 2021, people began photoshopping Graggle into more and more real scenes from the show, building a small library of fake screenshots that could be passed around as proof. The more images that existed, the more real he seemed, because a single doctored picture is easy to dismiss, while a dozen of them start to feel like a pattern. Each new forgery made the next one more believable. The figure that had spent years as a single forgotten joke became, almost overnight, a shared argument about memory itself. What truly gave Graggle his strange power were the competing stories invented to explain him, because the people building the hoax could not agree on which lie was funnier. One version claimed that the show's creator, Matt Groening, had introduced Graggle as a version of himself, and had been quietly slipping the character into episodes ever since the very first season in 1989. Another version claimed the opposite, that Graggle was a recent addition, dropped into the show around 2015 in a desperate attempt to attract new viewers. A third version claimed that the character had been there for years and was then erased through a quiet rewriting of the show's history, scrubbed from existence the way an embarrassing detail might be. These stories contradict each other completely, and that contradiction is the clearest sign of what was really going on. A genuine memory tends to point in one direction. A manufactured one can point everywhere at once, because its creators are not remembering anything. They are inventing. An invention has no obligation to stay consistent. Graggle could be an original character from 1989 and a modern cash grab and a deleted secret all at the same time. Because none of it was true, and untrue things can wear as many costumes as their makers please. This is where the honest distinction has to be drawn, because Graggle is not quite the same animal as the cases that came before him. The memory of a man dying in prison arose on its own, without anyone planning it. The tailless cartoon monkey, the missing monocle, the misquoted film lines, all of these grew naturally out of the ordinary slippage of human memory. Graggle did not grow naturally out of anything. He was built on purpose. He was a deliberate attempt to manufacture a Mandela effect from scratch, to construct a false memory in a laboratory of doctored images and see whether real people would adopt it as their own. In other words, Graggle was a parody of the very phenomenon this video is about. The people who created and spread him were mocking the idea of collective false memory by trying to prove how easily one could be made. They were testing whether a familiar enough style, a convincing enough fake, and a confident enough backstory could trick a crowd into remembering something that had never happened. And the unsettling part of the answer is that, for a meaningful number of people, it worked. Why it worked is the part that connects straight back to the foundation laid earlier. The Simpsons is absorbed loosely, over decades, by an audience that half watches it and trusts its own soft memories of it. The show is stuffed with so many minor characters that no single viewer could ever hold all of them in mind at once. Springfield is crowded with one-off faces, background figures, and oddball townspeople who appear briefly and are never seen again. A pale, round-headed stranger glimpsed in a single old frame does not feel out of place in a town that already contains hundreds of strange faces. The mind, asked whether it remembers him, cannot say for certain that it does not, and that uncertainty is all a good hoax needs. A maybe is far more useful to a lie than a yes. The design of the figure was clever in this exact way. Graggle was drawn to look like the kind of character the show might plausibly have created and forgotten. He was odd, but not so odd that he broke the world. He fit the rhythm of the show closely enough that the mind could imagine him into a half-remembered episode without much resistance. A fan who knows the feel of the show so well that they can sense what belongs in it is, strangely, more vulnerable to this trick because their own familiarity becomes the tool used against them. They know what a Simpsons character looks like, and Graggle was built to look like one. There is a reason the trick was even possible, and it lies in something the show actually did, long before anyone dreamed up the hoax. The Simpsons really has expanded its family before. In the second season, an episode introduced Homer's long-lost half-brother, a wealthy car company owner named Herb Powell, voiced by Danny DeVito. Herb returned in a third-season episode, his fortunes risen and fallen, and then he quietly faded out of the show. He remained part of the family's history in a technical sense, but the writers chose not to keep building on him, eventually preferring to poke fun at the whole idea of suddenly revealed relatives rather than keep adding them. Herb Powell matters here because he is the real version of what Graggle only pretended to be, a genuine new member of the family, introduced with fanfare and then allowed to drift into the background until many casual viewers half forgot he was ever there. Anyone who lived through the soft fading of Herb Powell has first-hand experience of a Simpsons relative who arrived, mattered briefly, and then mostly vanished from the show's attention. That lived experience makes the Graggle claim feel possible. The mind reasons, perhaps without noticing it is reasoning at all, that the show has done this kind of thing before, so why not once more? The hoax borrowed its plausibility from a true story. As the joke spread, the people who run online spaces devoted to the show found themselves in an odd position. Some communities built around Simpsons images grew tired of the endless Graggle posts and the arguments they stirred up, and began removing references to the character altogether. A figure who had never existed was now being formally banned from places that celebrate the show, which is its own small monument to how real a fake thing can become once enough people argue about it. The character had no episodes and no voice, yet he had become disruptive enough to require moderation. Nothing about Graggle was real except the trouble he caused. The division he created is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals two different ways the human mind handles a manufactured memory. Some people, shown the doctored images and the invented lore, felt the tug of false recognition and leaned into it, deciding that they did, after a fashion, remember him. Others felt nothing and were baffled that anyone could be fooled. The gap between these two groups is not a gap in intelligence. It is a gap in how readily a given mind fills its own uncertainty with a comfortable yes. The phenomenon does not require everyone to fall for it. It only requires enough people to feel the maybe, and to mistake that maybe for a memory. What Graggle finally demonstrates is something a little humbling. A false memory does not have to arrive by accident. It can be assembled deliberately, dressed in a familiar style, handed a confident backstory, and released into a trusting audience, and a portion of that audience will absorb it as their own past. The same softness of memory that lets a real detail drift over 30 years can be aimed and exploited on purpose in a matter of months. Graggle was a controlled experiment in exactly that, run by anonymous strangers for their own amusement, and the result was a character who lives nowhere except in the gap between what people saw and what people think they saw. He is, in that sense, the purest case in this entire story, a being made entirely of false memory, with no real version sitting underneath him to compare against. Every other example ahead has a true original hiding behind the mistake, a real scene or a real line that the false memory has wandered away from. Graggle has no original at all. He is the mistake itself, given a name and a face, and just enough of a story to make people doubt their own minds. And that doubt, once it takes hold, does not stay neatly contained to invented characters. It spreads to real ones, and to real scenes, and to real moments that genuinely aired. The next case proves it. Because the strangest false memories are not always about things that never existed. Sometimes they are about something that absolutely did exist, something millions of people truly saw, placed by their memories in the wrong year, attached to the wrong moment in history, and turned into a prophecy that the calendar quietly refuses to support. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop followed a character who was built from nothing and still convinced people they remembered him, a false memory made on purpose. Next comes the opposite problem, a scene that truly aired and that millions place years too early. It became the most shared Simpsons prophecy of all, and the dates tell a very different story. Section 3. The Golden Escalator. Two images sit side by side, and the effect is immediate. On one side, real footage from June of 2015, the day a famous billionaire rode down a golden escalator to announce that he was running for president. A crowd gathered below him holding signs and cheering. On the other side, a cartoon version of almost exactly the same scene, drawn in the unmistakable style of The Simpsons, the same escalator, the same descending figure, the same cheering crowd, the same camera looking up from below. The match is close enough to raise the hair on the back of the neck. And underneath the pair of images runs a single confident claim. The cartoon, it says, aired in the year 2000. The show saw it all coming 15 years early. That claim traveled across the internet with extraordinary speed, and it is easy to understand why. The resemblance is genuinely striking. The escalator is there, the crowd is there, the signs, the angle, the descent, all of it lines up with the real event so neatly that coincidence feels like a weak explanation. For millions of people, the side-by-side comparison became proof that The Simpsons possessed some uncanny ability to glimpse the future, and the golden escalator became the single most shared piece of evidence for it. Of all the supposed Simpsons prophecies, this one spread the widest and stuck the hardest. The memory attached to it hardened into something specific. People did not simply believe the show had once made a joke about the billionaire becoming president. They believed they had seen this exact escalator scene in an episode from 2000, an episode many could even name. The conviction was detailed and dated. A scene, a year, a sense of having witnessed a prediction unfold. It carried every mark of a solid memory, which is precisely what makes it such a perfect example of the thing this video keeps circling back to. Because the escalator scene was never in any episode from 2000. It was never in any episode at all. The animated footage of the descent down the golden escalator comes from a short piece, only about 90 seconds long, released online to a video sharing site. In it, Homer becomes trapped inside the billionaire's hair, and the escalator descent is part of the gag. This short was not part of the regular run of the show. It was a small standalone bit, made to be posted online and watched in a minute or two, and the date it appeared is the detail that quietly destroys the entire prophecy. The short was posted in July of 2015. The real escalator announcement, the one it so closely resembles, took place in June of 2015, a few weeks earlier. The cartoon did not come first. The cartoon came second. It was made after the real event, by people who had just watched the real event, and who recreated it as a joke precisely because it was already famous. The resemblance is not a prediction landing years ahead of time. It is a parody arriving weeks behind, copying something that had already happened, doing exactly what comedy does when a moment is fresh in everyone's mind. Laid out in plain order, the chronology leaves no room for mystery. In the middle of June 2015, a real man rode a real escalator to announce a real campaign, and the footage was everywhere. A few weeks later, in early July, the show's team released a short cartoon that copied that footage for a laugh. The arrow of time runs forward from the real event to the cartoon that imitated it. The popular memory simply reversed that arrow, placing the cartoon 15 years in the past and turning an imitation into a forecast. The order of events was flipped inside the minds of millions of people, and the flip felt like history rather than error. Now, none of this means the show never mentioned the billionaire as president before 2015. This is where the case grows interesting rather than simply false, because there is a real grain of truth buried under the false memory, and the grain is what makes the whole thing so believable. The show did make such a joke in the year 2000. It just looked nothing like the escalator. In a season 11 episode that aired in March of 2000, the story flashes forward to a future in which a grown Lisa Simpson has become president of the United States, described as the first straight female president. Sitting in the Oval Office with her advisors, she remarks that the country has inherited quite a budget crunch from the previous president, and she names that previous president as the billionaire in question. One of her advisors confirms that the nation is broke. That is the entire reference. A single line of dialogue, spoken in passing, about a fictional future. No escalator. No golden hair, no cheering crowd. The man himself is never even shown on screen. The whole prediction, as it truly existed in 2000, was one throwaway joke in a list of future gags. So the popular memory is built from two real pieces, stitched together and misdated. There is a genuine reference to the billionaire as president from the year 2000 with no visual to it. And there is a genuine animated escalator scene from 2015 made after the fact. The mind took the early date from the first piece and the vivid image from the second, fused them into a single false memory, and produced something that never existed in that combined form. Two true things became one untrue thing, and the untrue thing felt more real than either of the true ones. Even the original joke from 2000 was less of a wild guess than the prophecy story suggests. The billionaire had been publicly toying with the idea of running for president for years before that episode aired. He had floated it, talked about it, and tied his name to the notion often enough that he was a recognizable choice for a joke about an unlikely future leader. The writers, by their own accounts in interviews afterward, were not gazing into a crystal ball. They were reaching for a famous name that would make a future presidency sound absurd, and his name was already attached to that idea in the public mind. One of the show's writers later described the joke as a kind of warning, a way of imagining a country left battered and broke, with Lisa stepping in to clean up the wreckage. The point was never to predict a specific man on a specific escalator. The point was to picture a nation in trouble and to use a familiar name as the shorthand for how it got there. Why this particular false memory spread so far and held on so tightly comes straight back to the machinery described at the start. Human memory does not store events with timestamps attached. It stores impressions, and it reconstructs the order of those impressions later, often badly. A person who saw the real announcement in 2015, then saw the cartoon short soon after, then saw the old 2000 line resurface online, holds three separate true memories with no reliable sense of which came first. The mind, asked to make sense of them, arranges them into the most satisfying story available, and the most satisfying story is the one where the cartoon saw everything coming. A boring sequence of imitation and coincidence gets quietly rewritten into a thrilling sequence of prophecy, and the rewrite happens without any awareness that rewriting has taken place. The internet then did what the internet does, which is to take a satisfying story and reinforce it until it sets like concrete. The side-by-side images were shared millions of times. Videos appeared pairing the cartoon escalator with the real one, often dressed up with eerie music and a tone of hushed amazement, presenting the resemblance as something close to supernatural. Each share carried the false date along with the image, and each viewer who accepted it became another voice repeating it. A false memory held by one person is fragile. A false memory held by millions, confirmed by every friend who reposts it, becomes nearly impossible to dislodge. The social proof does the work that personal certainty cannot. When everyone seems to remember the same prediction, doubting it starts to feel like doubting the obvious. There is a particular reason this case is more stubborn than the invented character that came before it. Graggle could be checked against the simple fact that no such character was ever drawn. The escalator memory resists that kind of check because every piece of it is partly true. The escalator scene is real. The 2000 prediction is real. The billionaire becoming president is real. Only the assembly is false. Only the order and the date and the fusion, And false assemblies of true parts are far harder to argue against than pure inventions. The person defending the memory can point at real things the whole time, never noticing that the real things have been rearranged into a shape that never occurred. This is the deeper lesson hiding inside the golden escalator, and it reaches well beyond one cartoon and one billionaire. A memory does not have to be made of false ingredients to be false. It can be made entirely of true ingredients, combined in an order that never happened, and it will feel exactly as trustworthy as a memory of something real. The mind is not lying when it produces such a thing. It is doing its ordinary work of building a coherent story out of scattered impressions, and sometimes the coherent story it builds is one that history simply did not write. The escalator never predicted anything. It only ever followed, weeks late, the event it pretended to foresee. And once that pattern is understood, it becomes possible to see it everywhere in the show's strange reputation as a fortune teller. The escalator is the loudest example, but it is not the oldest. Years before that golden descent, there was a far smaller image, a single detail tucked into the background of one episode, on screen for barely a second. Almost more noticed it when it first aired. Then a real tragedy struck a real city, and that tiny, forgotten background detail came roaring back into memory, reassembled into a prediction so chilling that people still argue about it. The next case is the 1-second image that an entire generation believes it remembers as a warning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop traced the most famous Simpsons prophecy of all, and found a real scene quietly moved years out of place, an imitation remembered as a forecast. Next comes a single image that lasted about 1 second on screen, ignored when it aired. After a real disaster, memory dragged it back and turned it into something far darker. Section 4. $9 and 2 Towers. In the autumn of 1997, the show aired a perfectly ordinary episode about a family trip. Homer had once left the family car parked illegally in New York City years earlier, and the story sent the Simpsons back to the city to retrieve it, with all the usual chaos that follows the family anywhere it goes. It was a comedy about tourists and traffic and a father in a bad mood. Among the jokes scattered through it was a small visual gag involving a cheap way to reach the city, the kind of throwaway detail the show buries in nearly every episode. It lasted about 1 second. Almost no one watching in 1997 gave it a moment's thought. The gag was a brochure. In one quick shot, a character holds up an advertisement for a bus fare to New York, and the price printed on it is $9. The brochure also shows a piece of the city skyline, and standing right beside that printed number 9 are the 2 towers of the World Trade Center, tall and narrow, rising up next to the digit. For 1 second, on a brochure, in a comedy about a parking ticket, the layout placed a 9 beside 2 upright towers. When the episode first aired, this meant nothing. It was a cheap bus fare and a recognizable bit of the New York skyline, exactly the sort of background detail that fills a frame and then vanishes. The towers were among the most famous buildings in the world, an obvious shorthand for the city, the way a cartoon set in Paris might show a quick sketch of a tall iron tower. A bus fare of $9 was a joke about how little the trip cost. Nobody connected the 2 halves of the image, because in 1997, there was nothing to connect them to. The shot came and went, and the episode moved on to its next gag, and the details settled into the vast pile of forgotten background jokes the show produces by the thousand. 4 years later, on a clear morning in September of 2001, those same 2 towers were destroyed in the worst attack the country had ever seen on its own soil. The date of that attack, written the way Americans write dates, was 9/11, and somewhere in the months and years that followed, someone remembered the brochure. The forgotten 1-second gag came roaring back into the collective memory, but it returned transformed. Seen through the shock of what had happened, the image read completely differently. The number 9 sat right beside the 2 towers, and 2 towers standing together look very much like the number 11. Read across, the brochure now seemed to spell out 9/11, the date of the tragedy, placed in plain sight 4 years before it occurred. An image that had meant nothing in 1997 suddenly seemed to mean everything. People shared it, stared at it, and felt the same chill that the golden escalator would later produce. The show, it seemed, had buried a warning of the disaster in the background of a silly episode. years ahead of time. What the image actually was had not changed at all. The brochure still advertised a $9 bus fare. The towers were still just the World Trade Center, drawn as part of the New York skyline because that is what stood in the New York skyline in 1997. The placement of the 9 beside the towers was a matter of layout, a designer at the show fitting a price and a picture into a small rectangle, with no thought of dates and no possible knowledge of what was coming. The meaning that millions of people now saw in the image was not put there by the show, it was put there by the viewers, in hindsight, after a real horror had given them a reason to look for warnings. This is a trick the human mind performs constantly, and it has been studied for a long time. The mind is built to find patterns, even in places where no pattern was ever placed. A face appears in the bark of a tree. A shape forms in a passing cloud. A meaning emerges from a random arrangement of a number and 2 buildings. The brain does not wait to confirm that a pattern is real before it feels real. It simply offers the pattern up, fully formed, and the feeling of recognition arrives with it. After a shock as enormous as that September morning, the mind goes hunting for sense, for some sign that the unthinkable could have been seen coming, and a forgotten cartoon brochure was exactly the kind of thing that Hunt could seize upon. The false memory that grew around the image is more subtle than the ones that came before, and it is worth pulling apart with care. The brochure is real. The episode is real. The towers and the 9 are really in that frame. What is false is the memory of intent and the memory of clarity. Many people came to remember the image as something deliberate, an ominous and pointed reference, drawn with dark purpose. Some recall it as clearer than it was, sharper, more obviously spelling out the date, as though the show had set the digits in bold and dared the audience to notice. The memory inflates the gag into a message. It adds weight and meaning that the original second of footage never carried, and it does so quietly, so that the person remembering feels they are simply recalling what was always there. The mind tends to do this with any forgotten detail that later collides with a major event. The detail itself stays the same. The significance attached to it grows enormously in hindsight, and the grown significance feels original, as if it had been obvious all along. A person looking at the brochure after 2001 cannot easily imagine the version of themselves who would have glanced at it in 1997 and felt nothing, because the meaning now seems so plain. The hindsight erases the innocence of the first viewing. It rewrites not the image, but the experience of the image, turning a shrug into a chill and then insisting the chill was there from the start. There is a bitter irony folded into this particular case, one that deepens the strangeness. The very episode that supposedly predicted the attack became, after the attack, something the show could no longer air freely. Because the story is set in New York and features the towers so prominently, with jokes built around them, the episode was quietly pulled from regular rotation for years following the tragedy. A piece of the show that millions came to treat as a chilling prediction of the disaster was, at the same time, treated by the people who handled the show as too painful to broadcast in the wake of that same disaster. The episode lived a double life. In the public imagination, it was a prophecy. In the practical world of what could be shown on television, it was a wound that had to be handled gently. Why this false memory holds on so firmly comes down to the emotional weight behind it, which is far heavier than the weight behind a misspelled bear or a missing monocle. A trivial false memory is easy to surrender because nothing is lost in admitting the mistake. A false memory tied to a national tragedy is different. It carries grief, fear, and the deep human wish to believe that catastrophe leaves traces, that the worst events are not entirely random, that somewhere a sign existed and could have been read. Letting go of the brochure prophecy means letting go of that small comfort, the comfort of a warning, and the mind resists giving up comforts of that kind. The pattern feels meaningful precisely because the event was unbearable, and the meaning takes some of the unbearable randomness away. The reinforcement that followed was, by now, a familiar engine. The image spread across the internet, paired with the date, presented as undeniable proof of foresight. Each share carried the inflated meaning along with the picture, and each viewer who accepted it became another source repeating it. Videos collected the brochure alongside other supposed predictions, set to solemn music, building a sense that the show possessed some power beyond comedy. The more the image circulated, the more deliberate it seemed, and the more deliberate it seemed, the more it circulated. A 1-second background gag became, through nothing but repetition and grief, one of the most discussed frames the show ever produced. Stepping back from the chill, the truth of the brochure is gentler and sadder than the prophecy. A designer fit a price and a skyline into a small space in 1997. A terrible thing happened in 2001 that had nothing to do with that design. And a grieving public, searching the past for signs, found a forgotten coincidence and dressed it in meaning it never had. No one at the show knew anything. No warning was buried. There was only a number, 2 famous buildings, and a layout, sitting innocently in a comedy about a parking ticket, waiting to be misread by a world that did not yet have a reason to read it darkly. The brochure is one image, one coincidence, 1 second of footage transformed by hindsight into a prophecy. On its own, it might seem like a strange and singular event. The deeper truth is that it is not singular at all. It is one product of a much larger process, a kind of machine that has been running quietly for decades, turning ordinary coincidences into remembered predictions on a scale that dwarfs any single image. The show airs so much, for so long, that coincidences are not rare events but a guarantee, and the human mind is standing ready to collect them. The next case is about that machine itself, about how a comedy that produced thousands of jokes came to be remembered as a fortune teller, and about why the predictions feel so convincing right up until the moment someone checks the details. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop followed a 1-second background gag that meant nothing in 1997 and became a prophecy only after grief gave it weight, a coincidence remembered as a warning. Next comes the machine behind all of it, the quiet process that turns decades of jokes into uncanny predictions. The pattern falls apart the moment the dates are checked. Section 5. The machine that builds memories. By now, the reputation has become almost a fact of culture in its own right. The Simpsons predicts the future. People say it the way they might mention the weather, casually, as something everyone already knows. The list grows longer every year, passed around in articles and videos and quiet conversations, a catalog of moments where the show supposedly saw something coming long before it happened. A future president, a national tragedy, a war, a piece of technology. Each new entry adds to the sense that a yellow cartoon family somehow possesses a window into events that have not yet occurred. The golden escalator and the $9 brochure are only 2 stops on a much longer road, and the road keeps getting paved. The honest question underneath all of it is simpler than the mystery suggests. How does a comedy show, written by ordinary people to make audiences laugh, end up with the reputation of a fortune teller? The answer is not supernatural, and it is not a single trick. It is a kind of machine, built partly out of the show itself, and partly out of the minds watching it. And once the workings of that machine are visible, the magic drains away and something far more human is left behind. Begin with the raw material, because the scale of it is easy to underestimate. The show has produced hundreds upon hundreds of episodes across more than 3 decades. Each of those episodes is crowded with jokes, references, background details, and quick glimpses of imagined futures. A great many storylines flash forward in time, showing what characters might become, what the world might look like, what absurd directions society might take. The show is also relentlessly topical, built on satire, constantly reaching for the politics and trends and anxieties of the moment it was made in. Add all of that together, and the result is a vast ocean of small predictions, guesses, jokes, and extrapolations, numbering well into the thousands across the years. That ocean is the first and most important ingredient, because of a simple truth about guessing. When something makes thousands upon thousands of guesses about the future, some of those guesses will turn out to be right. Not because of foresight, but because of sheer volume. Throw enough darts at the future, and a few will land near the center, and the ones that land are the only ones anyone bothers to remember. This is the quiet engine behind the whole reputation. The show made an enormous number of jokes about what might happen, and the handful that happened to align with real events became famous, while the overwhelming majority that aligned with nothing were forgotten the moment they aired. The hits are collected and celebrated. The misses vanish without a trace. A fortune teller who makes 10,000 predictions and is remembered only for the 10 that came true will always look uncanny, even though the math is entirely ordinary. A clear example of how this works arrived in early 2022, when a real war broke out and Russia invaded Ukraine. Almost immediately, an old episode resurfaced, one from 1998, in which a series of mishaps leads to a resurrected Soviet Union deploying its forces, with tanks rolling out and the old divisions of the Cold War springing back to life. People shared it as another stunning prediction, the show once again foreseeing a conflict decades early. Yet the original joke was never about Ukraine at all. It was a Cold War gag, built on the broad and obvious idea that old tensions with a powerful Eastern rival might one day flare up again. One of the people who has run the show for years responded to the renewed attention by pointing out, with some sadness, that this had not been a difficult thing to foresee. The return of conflict with a former superpower was a fear that had existed for decades. The episode did not glimpse a specific war. It made a joke about an obvious and long-standing anxiety, and an obvious anxiety eventually came true, as obvious anxieties sometimes do. That points to the second ingredient, which is informed guessing dressed up as prophecy. The people who wrote the show were, by and large, sharp and well-read, attentive to the trends of their time, and skilled at extrapolating where those trends might lead. A joke about a celebrity becoming president was not a wild leap, when the celebrity in question had already toyed publicly with the idea. A joke about a piece of future technology was often just a smart extension of where existing technology was clearly heading. A joke about a corporation swallowing another corporation was often a reasonable bet, given the direction business was already moving. None of this requires a window into the future. It requires intelligent people watching the present carefully and guessing sensibly about tomorrow. When such guesses land, they look like magic, but they are really just the product of paying attention, multiplied by the enormous number of guesses the show was making. The third ingredient is the one already met in the story of the brochure, the reshaping power of hindsight. A joke written loosely, with no specific event in mind, can be matched to a specific event after the fact, and the match will feel far more precise than the original ever was. A vague gag about chaos in a city becomes, in memory, a pointed prediction of one particular disaster. A throwaway line about a troubled future becomes, in hindsight, a detailed forecast of exactly what unfolded. The matching happens backward, after the real event has supplied the meaning, and the looseness of the original is quietly forgotten. People remember the joke as sharper, more specific, and more deliberate than it was, because the real event has sharpened it for them. The prediction grows more impressive every time it is retold, sanded down to fit the event it supposedly foresaw. The fourth ingredient is the most troubling, because it is not a matter of misremembering at all. Sometimes the predictions are simply fabricated. Images are altered, scenes are invented, and details are added that the show never produced, then passed around as genuine. A striking example concerns a map. One widely shared image claimed that the show had predicted the exact outcome of a presidential election, displaying a colored map of the country supposedly drawn years in advance. When that image is set beside the real result of the election it claimed to foresee, the two do not match. The cartoon version colors several states the wrong way, calling places one outcome that in reality went the other. The map that spread as proof of prophecy was either inaccurate or outright doctored, and it predicted nothing, yet it traveled just as far as the genuine cases, carried by the same eager sharing. The machine does not only bend real memories, it sometimes manufactures fake evidence from nothing and feeds it into the same hungry stream. Even when the footage is real, the reading of it is often bent through selection, picking the parts that fit and ignoring the parts that do not. The short that showed the billionaire descending the golden escalator also gestured at a series of future campaigns, several different election years laid out as a running joke. When the reputation machine got hold of it, people counted the years that had already come true and pointed to them as proof of foresight, while quietly passing over a later year in the same clip that had not yet arrived and might never play out as imagined. The clip was treated as a perfect record of 3 real campaigns, and the inconvenient extra date was simply left out of the retelling. A prediction looks far more accurate when the parts that miss are trimmed away and only the parts that hit are shown. The trimming happens almost automatically, because the mind is drawn to the satisfying matches and bored by the awkward leftovers. Holding these ingredients together is the same social engine that hardened every case before. A satisfying claim of prophecy spreads quickly, and each share strengthens it. Videos gather the supposed predictions into long, solemn compilations, set to unsettling music, presented with an air of hushed certainty. Each compilation carries the inflated meanings, the misstated scenes, the doctored images, and the cherry-picked clips, blending the few genuine informed guesses with the coincidences and the fabrications until they all look equally miraculous. A viewer encountering this stream has no easy way to sort the real informed satire from the lucky coincidence from the outright fake, and so the whole mass gets absorbed together as evidence of a single uncanny power. The reputation feeds the sharing, and the sharing feeds the reputation, and around it goes. What emerges from all of this is a clear picture of the machine, with no mystery left inside it. A comedy show ran for over 30 years, made tens of thousands of jokes, set countless stories in imagined futures, and satirized the trends of every era it lived through. A pattern-hungry audience, primed by hindsight to find warnings and by emotion to want them, watched all of this loosely over decades. The few jokes that happened to align with real events were collected, sharpened, and shared, while the vast majority that aligned with nothing were forgotten. Fabricated images were mixed in, accurate guesses were treated as supernatural, and the social internet hardened the whole collection into a reputation that now feels like common knowledge. The machine is half the show and half the viewer, and neither half is doing anything stranger than what shows and viewers have always done. The show is not psychic. It is large, topical, partly set in the future, and beloved enough that people pay close attention to its hits, and none at all to its misses. The viewers are not foolish. They are doing the ordinary human work of finding patterns and remembering the meaningful ones, the same work that produced every false memory in this story. Put a vast comedy together with a pattern-seeking mind, let them run for 3 decades, and a reputation for prophecy is not surprising. It is nearly inevitable. So far, this story has lived among invented characters, misplaced scenes, and reshaped coincidences. The machine of false prediction is one large branch of the show's strange relationship with memory, but it is not the only one. There is a quieter branch, one that does not involve the future at all, and it cuts even closer to home. It concerns the words themselves, the lines of dialogue people are certain they have heard, repeated to friends, quoted for years, treated as exact. The next case is about how the show is misquoted, about the words a great many people swear were spoken, and about how the actual lines slipped away while the false versions took their place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop took apart the machine that turns thousands of jokes into a handful of famous prophecies, built half from the show and half from the people watching it. Next comes a quieter kind of false memory, the lines the show never quite said. The exact words living in millions of minds often differ from the words that were actually spoken. Section 6. The words the show never quite said. People carry their favorite shows around in the form of lines. A catchphrase repeated to a friend. A joke quoted at the dinner table. A single sentence that becomes shorthand between people who both love the same thing, spoken with a grin because both of them know exactly where it came from. The Simpsons may be the most quoted comedy in television history, its lines woven so deeply into everyday speech that people repeat them without even remembering they belong to the show. And because those lines live in so many mouths, repeated so often across so many years, they have become memories like any other, which means they have done what memories do. They have drifted. A quoted line feels like the most solid kind of memory a person can hold. The words are exact. They have an order, a rhythm, a precise shape. and a person who has repeated them 1,000 times feels certain of every syllable. That certainty is exactly what makes misquotes so unsettling when they surface, because the gap between what was said and what is remembered is not a vague impression gone soft. It is a specific string of words, confidently held, that turns out to differ from the real string of words by just enough to matter. This happens to the most famous lines ever spoken on a screen, far beyond any cartoon. The terrible family secret revealed by the villain in the black helmet, the one nearly everyone quotes beginning with a name, was never spoken that way. The starship captain's request to be transported back aboard, repeated endlessly for decades, was never delivered in the exact words that live in the public mind. These misquotes are so widespread that almost no one notices they are misquotes at all. The wrong version has been repeated so many more times than the right one that it has effectively replaced it. If it can happen to lines that famous, watched and rewatched and studied by millions, then a comedy quoted as casually and as constantly as The Simpsons was never going to escape the same fate. The clearest case begins with the single most recognizable sound the show ever produced, the frustrated cry the father lets out whenever life goes wrong. Almost everyone can hear it instantly in their mind. It has been printed on shirts and mugs, spelled out in articles, and it eventually earned a place in one of the great dictionaries of the English language, recognized as a real word with a real meaning. People remember it as a deliberate, carefully chosen catchphrase, written into the character from the beginning, spelled out on the page exactly as it sounds, a signature line designed to define him. The truth of how that sound came to be is almost the opposite of the memory. In the early scripts, there was no spelled-out catchphrase at all. Whenever the moment called for the father to react with frustration, the writers simply wrote a stage direction asking for an annoyed grunt, leaving the actual sound entirely up to the performer. There was no word on the page. There was only an instruction to sound irritated. The voice actor, standing in the recording booth, had to invent something on the spot, and the sharp, clipped cry he produced became the sound the whole world now knows. The spelling that everyone recognizes came afterward, a way of writing down a noise that had originally lived only in the performance. The famous catchphrase that feels so designed and so eternal was, at its birth, an unwritten improvisation, a blank space in a script filled by a single quick decision in front of a microphone. That gap is worth sitting with, because it reveals something subtler than a misremembered word. People do not only misremember the lines themselves, they misremember the nature of the lines, the story of how they came to exist. The cry feels like it was always there, fully formed and intentional, a planned piece of the character. In reality, it was a happy accident, a grunt that found its shape through performance rather than writing. The memory smooths away the messy, improvised origin and replaces it with a cleaner story in which everything was deliberate from the start. The mind prefers the tidy version, the one where the iconic thing was always iconic, and so the tidy version is the one that gets remembered. A gentler example lives in one of the show's most beloved emotional moments, a small valentine handed from one child to another. A lonely boy, often mocked and overlooked, gives a girl in his class a card decorated with a little train, and the message on it plays on the sound a train makes, telling her in a clumsy, heartbreaking pun that he chooses her. The card became one of the most cherished images the show ever created, a perfect blend of sweetness and sadness that has been shared and referenced for decades. Here, the core memory is largely correct. The card is real, the pun is real, the tenderness is real. What drifts, in this case, are the edges. People misremember the exact wording, smoothing the awkward pun into something neater or stretching it into something it never quite said. They misplace the moment, attaching it to the wrong episode or the wrong season, certain it happened at a different point in the show's history than it did. Some misremember the surrounding scene, the details of who was there and what came next. The emotional center stays vivid precisely because it carried feeling, and feeling burns memories in deep. But the factual frame around that center, the wording and the timing and the context, blurs and shifts the way all memory blurs and shifts. A moment can be remembered with perfect emotional accuracy and considerable factual error at the very same time, and the strength of the feeling tricks the mind into trusting the faulty details that came attached to it. The force that drives all of this is something like a long game of telephone, played across an entire culture over 30 years. A line is spoken once on the show. A viewer repeats it to a friend, slightly off. The friend repeats it again, a little further from the original. It appears in writing, in jokes, in references, each version copied from the last rather than from the source. Over time, the repeated version, the one passed from person to person, drifts away from the version that was actually broadcast. And because almost no one goes back to check the original, the drifted version becomes the dominant one. It is repeated more often, heard more often, and therefore remembered more strongly than the true line it replaced. The misquote wins, not because it is better, but because it is repeated more, and repetition is what memory mistakes for truth. This is the same misinformation effect that shaped every case before it. New information, encountered after the original, quietly rewrites the memory of the original. A person who hears a misquote 100 times and the real line only once will end up remembering the misquote because their memory was built far more from the 100 repetitions than from the single true source. The mind does not keep a protected master copy of the original line, sealed away and safe. It keeps a living, changing impression, updated every time the line is encountered again, and if most of those encounters are with a flawed version, the impression bends toward the flaw. A related kind of false memory attaches to where the lines came from in the first place. The show produced so many phrases that entered everyday speech that people came to assume the show invented all of them, born fully formed from its writers. Some of its famous expressions, though, had lives before the show, or origins different from what the audience imagines, picked up, adapted, or reshaped from elsewhere, rather than created from nothing. The false memory here is one of ownership. A phrase feels like it must have started on the show, because that is where the person first heard it and most often heard it, and so the show is credited with inventing language it sometimes only borrowed and popularized. The mind assigns the origin to the most memorable encounter, which is rarely the true beginning. Why the show is so exposed to all of this comes back to the same loose, decades-long absorption that breeds its false visual memories. The Simpsons is quoted more casually and more constantly than almost anything else, by people who often half-watch the episodes the lines came from. The words get stripped from their scenes, repeated without context, merged across different episodes, and reshaped through endless retelling. A line from one season blends with a line from another. A phrase shifts to fit the situation it is being used in. The same softness that lets a person misremember a character or a scene lets them misremember a sentence, and a sentence misremembered is harder to catch because it feels so exact. A blurry image at least feels blurry. A confidently quoted line feels sharp and certain, even when it is wrong. What all of this leaves behind is a quiet realization about the words people treasure, the lines repeated at dinner tables and between old friends, the catchphrases that feel eternal and exact, are memories too, and memories drift no matter how often they are spoken. Some of the show's most quoted moments live, in the public mind, in a slightly different form than they ever took on the tapes. The cry that feels designed was improvised. The Valentine that feels precisely remembered has blurred at its edges. The phrases that feel invented were sometimes borrowed. None of this makes the lines less beloved. It only shows that even the words a person is most certain of are built from the same shifting material as everything else in memory. So far, this story has dealt mostly with spoken words and remembered scenes. There is one more kind of line, though, one that sits in a strange middle ground between the seen and the said. It is a line that appears on screen as written text, read rather than heard, which ought to make it harder to misremember since the words are right there in black and white. And yet it is one of the most consistently misquoted things the show ever produced. The next case is a single newspaper headline, glimpsed for a moment, that an enormous number of people are certain they can quote exactly, and that an enormous number of people quote slightly wrong. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop followed the lines the show never quite said, the catchphrases improvised rather than written, and the quotes reshaped by decades of retelling. Next comes a line that appeared on screen as written text, which should be impossible to misremember. Somehow it became one of the most misquoted moments the show ever aired. Section 7. Old Man Yells at Cloud. A grainy newspaper clipping shows an elderly cartoon man, mid-shout, one fist raised in helpless fury at nothing in particular. Above his photograph runs a headline that has become one of the most reused images the internet has ever produced. For well over a decade, that single picture has been pasted into countless online arguments, deployed whenever someone wants to gently mock a person complaining about something new, something modern, something they do not understand. The old man and his headline have become shorthand for being out of touch, for raging uselessly at change, for the eternal grumble of a generation watching the world move on without it. The reach of that image is genuinely enormous. It stopped being a joke from a single episode long ago and became a template, a blank form that people fill with whatever target they please. The verb changes, the cloud changes, the whole sentence gets rewritten to fit the moment, while the picture of the furious old man stays the same. It is one of the most flexible and most repeated reaction images in the entire culture of online jokes, recognized instantly by people who have never watched a full episode of the show in their lives. The headline outgrew its source so completely that, for many, the source barely exists anymore. Here is what makes this case so strange, and so different from the misquoted lines that came before. The headline is written text. It appears on screen in plain letters, fixed and readable, sitting right there above the photograph. A spoken line can slip away because it vanishes the instant it is said, leaving only an impression behind. A written line should be safe from that kind of drift, because the words are not a fleeting sound. They are printed. They can be paused, read, and reread. And yet this particular line, despite being written down and shown clearly, is one of the most consistently misquoted things the show ever produced. The very thing that should have protected it failed completely. The real scene comes from an episode that aired in March of 2002, deep in the show's 13th season. The title of that episode is a gentle play on a famous old novel about an aging man and the sea, swapping the sea for a different object entirely. The story follows Grandpa, the eldest Simpson, who has decided he wants his driver's license back. His reasons are tender and a little sad. A new resident has arrived at his retirement home, a woman he hopes to impress, and a rival who owns a vehicle has the advantage of being able to take her places. To compete, Grandpa needs to drive, and to drive, he needs a license. The famous headline appears almost in passing, as part of this small romantic plot. When the moment comes to take a photograph for the license, Grandpa does not pose for a fresh one. Instead, he produces an old newspaper clipping of himself and suggests using that picture. The clipping shows him shaking his fist, and the headline printed above it describes in plain words an old man yelling at a cloud. After he succeeds in getting his license, with that very photo on it, he walks over to a window, looks up at the sky, and shouts at a passing cloud, asking who is laughing now. The line and the image were a throwaway joke about a cranky old man with an absurd grudge against the weather, tucked inside a story about loneliness and the wish to feel useful again. Almost none of that surrounding story survives in the public memory. The romance is gone, the rival is gone, the retirement home and the license and the reason any of it was happening have all faded away. What remains is the fist and the cloud and the headline, lifted clean out of their scene and set loose to mean whatever the internet needed them to mean. The episode supplied the image, and then the image left the episode behind and never looked back. The first kind of drift is in the wording itself. Because the headline became a template, people rewrote it endlessly, swapping the verb, changing the cloud to something else, adding words to make it angrier or funnier or more specific to a fresh target. After years of seeing these altered versions far more often than the original, the precise wording of the real headline began to blur in the public mind. People quote it with a slightly different verb, or make the cloud plural, or stretch the line longer than it ever was, all while feeling completely certain they are quoting it exactly. The flood of variants washed over the original until, for a great many people, one of the variants became the version they remember best. The endlessly edited form quietly replaced the printed source, even though the printed source was right there to be checked the entire time. The second kind of drift is in the context. Stripped of its scene, the headline gets remembered as a standalone gag, a random funny newspaper that appeared for no reason, rather than as Grandpa's deliberate and cheapskate choice of an old photo to dodge a fresh one. The cleverness of the original joke, that an old man would proudly use an unflattering photo of himself at his angriest as official identification, is lost when the image is separated from its story. People remember the surface, the shouting man, and the cloud, and forget the small human reason the moment existed at all. The meme kept the picture and discarded the meaning, and the discarded meaning is now invisible to most of the people who use the image every day. There is a third wrinkle here, and it is the kind of honest complication this whole subject demands. Even the records that carefully catalog the show do not entirely agree on the details of the scene. When it comes to which of Marge's sisters is present and involved in the handling of Grandpa's license photograph, different accounts name different sisters. Some sources place one of the twins in the scene, others place the other. The two women look nearly identical and serve nearly identical roles in the show, which makes the confusion easy to understand, but it also means that the public record itself is slightly unsettled on this point. When the official catalogs cannot fully agree on who was in the room, it becomes almost unreasonable to expect a casual viewer watching once years ago to remember it correctly. The source of truth is itself a little blurry, and a blurry source can only produce blurry memories. What this case reveals, more sharply than any before it, is that being written down is no protection against false memory. The instinct says that a line shown on screen in clear letters should be impossible to misremember, because anyone can simply look at it and read it. But almost nobody builds their memory of the headline from the episode. They build it from the meme, from the thousands of times they saw the image online, reshaped and rewritten and reused. The meme, not the episode, became the source that the memory was made from, and the meme was never stable. It mutated with every use, so the memory mutated along with it. This is the same lesson from the misquoted spoken lines, only sharper, because here the original was literally written in front of everyone. The version a person encounters most often is the version they remember, regardless of whether it matches the source. A spoken line drifts because the original vanishes the moment it is heard. A written line drifts for a different reason because the original is encountered once or twice while the altered copies are encountered thousands of times. In both cases, the most repeated version wins, and the most repeated version of the cloud headline was never the one printed in the episode. It was the swarm of edits that came after. The old man and his cloud have become a permanent fixture of how people talk to one another online, a tool for mocking the out of touch. The irony sits right on the surface once it is pointed out. The image is used to laugh at people whose memories and habits have failed to keep up with reality, and the image itself is remembered inaccurately by the very people wielding it. The fist is right. The cloud is right. The general spirit of the joke is right. The exact words, the precise scene, and the small sad reason behind it have drifted away, replaced by a smoother, more useful version that the culture built for its own purposes. A line a person could pause and read with their own two eyes, still slipped its moorings the moment it left the episode and entered the wild. That is how powerful repetition is, and how weak the original always is against it. The printed word offered no shield. The meme simply encountered the audience more often than the show did, and memory, as ever, sided with whatever it met most. If a single written headline can drift this far, the question naturally grows larger. What happens not to one line, but to entire scenes? What happens to the gags, the openings, the little recurring bits that people are sure they remember in full, replayed in the mind in vivid detail? The next case moves from a single misquoted line to whole moments of the show that people can describe with total confidence, moments they can picture clearly and recount step by step, and that never aired at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop followed a written headline that drifted anyway, overwritten by the endless edits of a meme that the audience met far more often than the episode itself. Next comes the leap from single lines to entire scenes. Some of the gags people remember in perfect detail were never animated at all. Section 8. Couch gags from another timeline. Few pieces of footage have been watched as many times by as many people as the opening of The Simpsons. For more than 30 years it has played at the start of nearly every episode, a familiar little sequence that announces the show is about to begin. People who grew up with it have seen it thousands of times over their lives, often without even watching it closely, letting it roll in the background while they settled in. It is burned into memory as deeply as a childhood home or a favorite song, recalled instantly, hummed without thinking, recognized from its very first note. By any reasonable measure, it should be the single best remembered thing the show ever made. A strange contradiction sits at the heart of that familiarity, though. A person who has seen the opening thousands of times has, in a real sense, never seen the same opening twice. The sequence was built from the beginning to change. Certain parts of it stay fixed, repeated identically every time, while other parts are different in almost every single episode. So the thing burned so deeply into memory is not one stable image at all. It is a shifting collection of thousands of slightly different versions, layered on top of one another over decades, blended into a single impression that feels solid, but was never solid for a moment. The fixed parts are easy to picture. The sequence opens in the clouds, drifts down toward the town, and moves through Springfield as the family makes its separate ways home. Each member traveling through the streets until all of them converge on the living room and pile onto the couch in front of the television. That broad shape is the same every time. The clouds, the town, the rush toward the couch. These are the steady bones of the opening, the part a person can genuinely rely on having seen again and again in the same form. Everything interesting, though, lives in the parts that change. As the sequence begins, the eldest child is shown writing a line over and over on a school chalkboard, and that line is different in nearly every episode, a fresh joke each time. As the family travels home, the boy rides his skateboard past a parade of townspeople, and the route and the faces shift from episode to episode. The daughter plays a brief solo on her saxophone, which has varied across the show's history. And at the very end, as the family reaches the couch, comes the most beloved variable of all, the couch gag. A small, self-contained joke about the family sitting down that is almost never the same twice. Sometimes the couch collapses. Sometimes the family arrives to find something waiting for them. Sometimes the whole gag spirals into an elaborate flight of fantasy lasting far longer than the rest of the opening combined. The scale of this variation is genuinely difficult to grasp. Across the show's enormous run, there have been hundreds upon hundreds of distinct couch gags, and hundreds upon hundreds of distinct chalkboard lines, each one made for a single episode and then retired. Some of the couch gags are simple and quick, others are remarkably ambitious, handed to guest animators or built as parodies of other films and styles, little works in their own right. No human being could possibly hold all of them in memory with any accuracy. There are simply too many, encountered too casually, spread across too many years. The mind was never going to file each one away in its own labeled drawer. It did what minds do with floods of similar material. It blended them. This blending is exactly where the false memories grow, and the mechanism is the same one met all the way back at the beginning of this story. The mind stores the general pattern of a thing, the gist, the sense of how it usually goes, and then fills in the specific details from expectation when a particular memory is called for. After watching hundreds of couch gags, a person does not retain hundreds of separate films. They retain a powerful sense of what a couch gag is, what shape it takes, how it tends to surprise. And when asked to recall a specific one, the mind can assemble a perfectly plausible couch gag out of that general sense, complete with vivid detail, that was never actually a single aired gag at all. It might be a blend of 3 real ones. It might be an invention that simply fits the format so well that it feels real. The viewer describing it is not lying and is not confused in any obvious way. They are doing the ordinary work of reconstructing a memory, and the format handed them all the raw material they needed to reconstruct one that never existed. The familiarity itself is the trap, which is the cruelest part. A person who knows the rhythm of these gags so intimately, who could sketch the structure of one in their sleep, is more able to compose a false one, not less. Their deep knowledge of what belongs lets them build something that belongs perfectly, and a thing that belongs perfectly is nearly impossible to recognize as false. This is the very same trick that made the invented character so convincing earlier in this story. Knowing the show well does not protect a person from false memory of the show. It equips them to manufacture false memories that fit seamlessly into everything they truly saw. A second layer of confusion comes from the fact that the opening did not stay the same across the decades. At a certain point, the show moved to a sharper, higher quality picture, and the entire sequence was rebuilt to match. Many small details changed in that rebuilding. New jokes appeared in the town. Old elements were redrawn or rearranged. The version of the opening a person remembers most vividly depends heavily on when they grew up watching, on which era of the show formed the deepest grooves in their memory. And because most viewers never consciously notice the moment the sequence changed, they tend to remember a single opening rather than the several different ones that actually existed. Details from one era get attached to another. A feature someone is certain was always present may have arrived only later, or vanished only recently, and their confidence papers over the seam where the versions were stitched together in memory. There is even a precise, tiny detail buried in the opening that most people have looked at thousands of times and never once truly registered. In the sequence where the family converges, the baby is shown being scanned at a grocery store checkout, passed over the scanner like an item being purchased, and a price appears on the register. That price was reportedly chosen with a small joke in mind, meant to reflect the cost of raising a baby, a quiet bit of commentary hidden inside a half-second of animation. The vast majority of people who have watched the opening countless times could not say what the register showed, or even that the register showed anything at all, because the moment passes so quickly and sits inside a sequence too familiar to actually watch. A specific, deliberate detail, placed in the most viewed footage of the audience's lives, slips past nearly everyone, which is its own quiet proof of how little of even our most repeated experiences we truly absorb. Put all of these forces together, and the opening turns out to be the single most fertile ground for false memory in the entire show. It combines the two ingredients that most reliably produce confident error. There is maximum familiarity, because it is the part watched more than any other, which gives people unshakable confidence that they know it, and there is maximum variability, because its key parts changed in almost every episode and were rebuilt across eras, which means there was never a single stable original to know in the first place. Confidence built on top of variation is the exact recipe for a vivid memory of something that never aired. People feel they know the opening better than almost anything, and that very feeling is what makes their memories of its details so unreliable. The lesson cuts against every instinct about how memory should work. It seems obvious that seeing something 1,000 times would carve it perfectly into the mind. That repetition would guarantee accuracy. The opposite turns out to be closer to the truth when the thing being repeated keeps changing. Watching 1,000 slightly different versions of something does not produce one sharp, correct memory. It produces a confident blur, a smooth average of everything seen, that feels like a single clear recollection while actually corresponding to no single real moment. The audience did not fail to pay attention. They paid a casual kind of attention thousands of times to a thing that refused to hold still, and a moving target watched casually leaves behind exactly this kind of certain, detailed, and often mistaken impression. So the gags people swear they remember, replayed in the mind with such clarity, occupy a peculiar space. Some of them are real, aired once and genuinely recalled. Some are blends, 2 or 3 real gags fused into one that never existed as a unit. And some are pure compositions, built by a mind that knew the format so well it could write a new gag without realizing it was writing rather than remembering. The viewer cannot easily tell which is which, because all three feel identical from the inside. The real memory and the invented one arrive with the same confidence, wearing the same vivid detail, and there is no internal signal that separates them. Up to this point, every false memory in this story has shared one quiet comfort. The truth, however blurry or buried, still existed somewhere, and could in principle be checked. The episodes were still there. The frames could be found and examined. The original line, the original scene, the original gag sat safely on the tapes, waiting for anyone who cared to go back and look. That stability is what allowed the mistakes to be measured at all. But the show's history holds a darker corner, where that comfort disappears entirely. Some episodes were genuinely pulled. Some scenes were genuinely altered. Some moments were quietly removed from the places people would go to check them, so that a person trying to confirm a memory finds nothing there to confirm it against. When the original itself has been taken away, the line between true memory and false memory does not just blur, it dissolves completely. The next case is about the episodes that changed behind the audience's back, and about what happens to memory when the evidence it would lean on has been erased. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop revealed why the most watched footage of all, the opening sequence, is also among the least reliably remembered, a confident blur built from 1,000 shifting versions. Next comes the darkest corner, the episodes and scenes that were genuinely removed or changed. When the evidence itself disappears, memory loses the one thing that kept it honest. Section 9. The episodes that vanished. There is a quiet comfort in believing that the show is permanent. The episodes have always been there, after all. They aired, they entered reruns, they moved on to streaming, and they wait patiently to be summoned again whenever a person wants to revisit a favorite. This sense of permanence sits underneath the whole experience of loving a long-running show. Whatever a person remembers, the original is safe somewhere, ready to settle any argument, ready to confirm or correct any memory. The tape, it is assumed, never changes. The show simply is what it always was. That assumption is not entirely true, and the places where it fails are where this story takes its darkest and most genuinely unsettling turn. Across more than 30 years, the show has not stayed perfectly fixed. Some episodes have been quietly removed from the places people would go to find them. Some scenes have been edited or altered after the fact. Some have been trimmed for time so often that the version playing in reruns differs from the version that first aired. The canon, the supposedly solid body of work, has shifted more than once, and when it shifts, it takes a piece of memory's foundation with it. The clearest example involves an episode from the show's third season, broadcast in the autumn of 1991, the very first episode of that season. In it, Homer is mistakenly sent to a mental institution, where he meets a fellow patient, a large man with a gentle voice who is utterly convinced that he is a world-famous pop singer. The character was given the name Leon Kompowski, and he was voiced by that very singer, performing under a false name in the credits, listed as an unknown figure called John J. Smith, though audiences at the time generally understood who it really was. The episode is remembered fondly by many, in part for a tender moment near its end, in which the character helps write a birthday song for Lisa, a small piece of music composed specially for the episode that became beloved in its own right. For most of 3 decades, it was simply one more well-liked entry in the show's long history, replayed in reruns, included on home video, and revisited by fans who treasured its sweetness. In 2019, that changed. A documentary renewed serious allegations of abuse against the singer, allegations of a deeply disturbing kind, and the people responsible for the show faced a difficult choice. The show's creator and its most senior producers discussed the matter together and decided to pull the episode entirely. It was removed from the streaming platform where the show now lives, taken out of the syndicated reruns that air on television, and set aside from any future collections and releases. The producers explained that they felt it was the right thing to do, given what the episode had come to represent, and that they could no longer comfortably present it as part of the show. Whatever a person thinks of that decision, its effect on memory is the part that matters here. An entire episode, one that genuinely aired and was genuinely watched by millions, was deliberately and permanently withdrawn from nearly every place a person would normally go to find it again. Consider what that does to a memory. A person who clearly recalls that episode, who remembers the gentle patient and the birthday song written for Lisa, now reaches for it and finds it missing. It is not in the usual place. It does not appear in the lineup of streaming episodes. It does not surface in the rerun rotation the way it once did. The easy act of going back to check, the act that settles every ordinary argument about what really happened, suddenly returns nothing at all, and a memory that cannot be checked begins to feel different. It grows uncertain, slightly unreal, almost dreamlike, even when the person is remembering something that absolutely occurred. The removal of the episode manufactures the exact sensation of a false memory around something entirely true. The person did see it. They are remembering correctly. But the world no longer offers the confirmation it always used to, and without that confirmation, certainty quietly erodes, like a path that grows over once no one is allowed to walk it. The false name in the credits points to a smaller related source of confusion that ran through the show for years. Guest stars sometimes appeared under invented names rather than their own, a playful tradition the show enjoyed. A famous actor once voiced a character while being credited under a made-up name, and audiences were left to recognize the voice for themselves. Over time, this practice planted little seeds of uncertainty in the audience's memory. People grew unsure who had really voiced whom, whether a particular performance was truly the famous person it sounded like or merely an impression, whether a guest appearance they vividly recalled had even happened the way they thought. The show, in other words, was occasionally hiding the truth of its own making in plain sight, and a memory built on top of a deliberate disguise was always going to be a little shakier than one built on plain fact. A second case has already appeared earlier in this story, and it deepens when seen from this angle. The episode set in New York, the one containing the brochure that was later read as a prophecy, prominently featured the towers that were destroyed in 2001. After that tragedy, the episode was pulled from regular rotation for a long stretch of years, judged too painful to air while the wound was fresh. When it did slowly return in some places, certain jokes and images involving the towers were altered or quietly dropped, including a sequence built around an unpleasant encounter at the base of the buildings. People who watched the episode in the years after it first aired formed memories of the original version, complete with the jokes exactly as they were first broadcast. Those memories are accurate. They reflect what truly aired in 1997, but the version that later circulated, on the occasions when it circulated at all, was sometimes a different cut, missing pieces that the original contained. A person remembering the first version is remembering a thing that effectively no longer exists in the form they saw it. Their memory is correct, and the available evidence has drifted away from it, which leaves them in the strange position of accurately recalling something the record can no longer fully back up. They are right, and the proof of their rightness has been edited out from under them. A third kind of removal happens not because of tragedy or scandal, but because of politics, and it does not happen everywhere at once. In certain parts of the world, particular episodes have quietly gone missing from the major streaming platform, removed because their content was considered objectionable by a government. One such episode from the show's 16th season includes a pointed joke set at a famous location, a sign placed there claiming that nothing happened at that spot in a particular year, the entire joke being that something terrible very much did happen there and is officially denied by the authorities of that country. That episode exists and can be found in much of the world, yet for viewers in a particular region it simply is not there. It was left out of the catalog, absent and unsearchable, while the rest of the world could watch it freely. The same pattern repeated years later with a different episode, when a single line of dialogue referencing forced labor and the goods it produces was apparently enough to keep that episode out of the catalog in the same region. Two separate episodes, made years apart, both vanishing in the same place for the same kind of reason. A person living in that region who remembers either episode, or who hears people elsewhere discussing it, may search for it and find absolutely nothing, while people in other countries insist with total confidence that it is real and easy to find. The truth becomes local. What exists depends on where a person happens to be standing, and that alone is enough to make a genuine memory feel like a private hallucination to the person who holds it, a recollection no one around them can confirm, and the local record flatly denies. Beyond these dramatic removals lies a quieter and far more widespread kind of change, one that has touched almost every episode the show has ever made. When episodes move into syndicated reruns, they are frequently trimmed to make room for more advertising. A few seconds here, a small exchange there, a joke that ran a beat too long, all gently shaved away so the episode fits a tighter slot. Most viewers never notice the cuts happening, because the episodes still play smoothly and still make sense. But a person who first saw an episode on its original broadcast and who later watched the trimmed rerun many times may carry a memory of a joke that the rerun version no longer contains. They recall a line that is simply not there anymore in the version they have access to. If they go looking for it in the reruns or in a casual rewatch, they will not find it, and they may quietly conclude that they imagined it. In truth, they remembered the original perfectly. The version available to them was simply the shortened one, with the remembered moment quietly removed for time. Across thousands of small cuts, This has surely produced a vast and invisible field of true memories that the most easily available copies can no longer confirm. These removals and edits matter far beyond the specific episodes involved, because of what they teach the audience as a whole. Once people learn that real episodes really were pulled, and that real scenes really were altered or trimmed, a door opens in the mind. Every shaky memory suddenly gains a new layer of plausibility. The reasoning runs quietly underneath conscious thought. Perhaps the scene half remembered, the one that cannot be found, was real after all, and was simply taken away like the others. Real erasure lends credibility to false memory. It provides a ready-made explanation for any gap between what a person recalls and what they can locate, and that explanation is far more flattering to the memory than the alternative, which is that the memory was never accurate to begin with. Given a choice between believing they were wrong and believing the show was changed, many people will reach for the second, because the second lets their memory keep its dignity. This is precisely the soil in which one of the earlier cases grew. The invented character from the start of this story came wrapped in a claim that he had once been part of the show and was later scrubbed from it through a quiet rewriting of its history. That claim worked because the audience already knew, on some level, that the show really does remove things. The hoax borrowed the credibility of genuine erasure. It dressed a pure invention in the clothing of a real phenomenon, and the real phenomenon made the invention believable. A person who knows that an entire episode can vanish is far more willing to believe that a character could have vanished too, even one who never existed at all. The truth of the removals became cover for the lie of the false memory, and the two grew tangled together until they were hard to tell apart. There is a reverse version of this problem, and it is just as disorienting. Sometimes it is not the memory that is wrong, but the world that is changed underneath it. A person who grew up watching one cut of an episode, and who later encounters a different, edited cut, genuinely remembers content that the current version no longer contains. If they describe what they remember, they may be told they are mistaken, that no such moment exists, that they must be confusing it with something else. Yet they are not confused. They saw the original. The truth itself moved, quietly, between their first viewing and their attempt to confirm it, and so their honest and accurate memory now looks like an error. They end up accused of misremembering reality when in fact reality was revised after they remembered it correctly, which is a strange and lonely place for a memory to find itself. This is why this case is the most destabilizing in the entire story, more so than any invented character or misplaced scene. Every earlier false memory rested on a comforting foundation. The original always existed. The tape could be found, the frame could be examined, the line could be checked, and the truth, however buried, was sitting safely in place waiting to settle the matter. That stability is what made it possible to call a memory false at all, because there was a fixed reality to measure it against. Here, that foundation cracks. The tape itself has changed, been trimmed, or disappeared. The anchor that kept memory honest has been pulled out of the seabed. When the record can move, the clean line between remembering and imagining cannot be drawn, because there is no longer a fixed point from which to draw it. The permanence of the show, it turns out, was always partly an illusion. A living work that runs for decades is not a sealed object resting safely in a vault. It is something handled, revisited, trimmed, and reconsidered over many years, subject to the changing judgments of the people who make it, the practical demands of the channels that carry it, and the political pressures of the places it travels to. Episodes get pulled when they become painful or shameful. Scenes get edited when the world shifts around them, lines get shaved away to fit a schedule, whole entries go missing in some regions and survive in others. Each of these changes is usually made for an understandable reason, and each one leaves behind a small hole where certainty used to be, a place where a real memory can no longer reach back and touch the real thing that made it. The holes are scattered everywhere, mostly invisible, and a person never knows they have stepped into one until they reach for a memory and find nothing waiting to confirm it. That brings this long walk to its final question, the one that has been waiting underneath every case from the beginning. If memory drifts on its own, and the record it would lean on can itself be moved, then the certainty people feel about their own pasts is far more fragile than anyone comfortably admits. A cartoon family, drawn in bright colors to make people laugh, has somehow become the clearest mirror ever held up to that fragility. The last section steps back from the individual cases to ask why this happened, why human memory works the way it does, and why, of all the things in the world, it was this particular show that taught a whole culture to doubt what it remembers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop followed the episodes and scenes that were genuinely removed or changed, and showed how real erasure quietly corrodes the line between true memory and false. Next comes the final question this whole story has been circling: why human memory fails the way it does, and why a cartoon became the place an entire culture learned to doubt itself. Section 10. Why memory betrays us. Return for a moment to the quiet that opened this whole story. A woman stood among friends and described grieving a man who had not died. She remembered the news, the mourning, the speech, and none of it had happened, and the strangest part was that she was not alone in the error. That small moment, years ago and far from any cartoon, was the seed of everything that followed. It revealed that memory could fail not just privately but together, that a crowd of strangers could share the same false certainty, and that the failure could feel exactly like truth from the inside. Everything in this long walk has been a variation on that single, humbling discovery. What began as a footnote about a misremembered death has, across these hours, grown into something larger, and the shape of it can finally be seen whole. A cartoon family, drawn in bright colors and meant mostly to make people laugh, turned out to be the clearest mirror ever held up to the unreliability of human memory. That was the claim made at the very beginning, offered then as a proposal. By now, it should feel less like a proposal and more like something that has been proven case by case, patiently, until the weight of the examples makes it hard to deny. The show did not break anyone's mind. It simply gave the ordinary failures of memory a stage large enough and familiar enough for an entire culture to watch them happen at the same time. Walk back through the cases as a single progression, and each one reveals a different way that memory can fail, building one on top of the last. The invented characters showed that a false memory can be manufactured from nothing at all, built deliberately and dressed in a familiar style until people adopt it as their own past. The golden escalator showed that a memory can be made entirely of true pieces, a real scene and a real line, fused in an order that never happened and misdated by 15 years. The brochure showed that a meaningless coincidence can be filled with significance in hindsight, transformed by grief into a prophecy it never was. The reputation for prediction showed that the same forces, multiplied across decades and millions of viewers, form a machine that turns ordinary jokes into uncanny foresight by remembering only the hits and quietly forgetting the misses. The misquoted lines showed that even exact words drift, because the version a person hears most often overwrites the version that was actually spoken. The cloud headline showed that being written down offers no protection, because a meme repeated endlessly can overwrite even printed text that anyone could pause and read. The opening sequence showed that the most watched footage of a person's life can be the least reliably remembered, because watching 1,000 slightly different versions produces not one sharp memory, but a confident blur. And the vanished episodes showed the deepest fracture of all, the moment when the record itself moves, when the tape that was supposed to settle every argument is trimmed or pulled or erased, leaving a true memory with nothing left to lean on. Each case is a different lesson, and together they form a single argument about how fragile the past really is, even a past stored in living color and replayed 1,000 times. Researchers who study memory have spent a long time taking apart the machinery behind all of this, and what they have found is, in its own quiet way, stranger than any parallel universe. The deepest truth is that memory was never the recording device people assume it to be. It does not capture an event and store it untouched, the way a camera fills a card with images that stay exactly as they were taken. Memory works by reconstruction. Each time a memory is recalled, the mind rebuilds it from fragments, and each rebuilding is an opportunity for small changes to slip in unnoticed. A detail gets smoothed, a gap gets filled with whatever seems to fit. A suggestion from someone else gets folded in and absorbed. The memory that feels like a faithful replay is actually a fresh construction, assembled in the present moment, out of pieces that may have drifted far from the original event. The feeling of remembering and the act of inventing share the same machinery, which is why a false memory can feel every bit as solid as a true one. A large part of this rebuilding runs on expectation. The mind stores the general sense of a thing, the gist of how it tends to go, and then fills in the specific details from what it expects, rather than from what it actually witnessed. A monkey is expected to have a tail, so the tailless cartoon monkey is remembered with one. A wealthy old-fashioned figure seems like the sort who would wear a monocle, so the memory hands him one he never owned. A couch gag is expected to follow a certain shape, so the mind can compose a brand new one that feels exactly like a real one. This reliance on expectation is usually helpful, because it lets the mind fill in the world quickly and efficiently without storing every detail. But the very same shortcut, when it fills a gap with something that was never there, produces a false memory that feels entirely natural, because it was built from the same expectations that built all the true ones. Confabulation is the name for one part of this process, and it describes something gentler than lying. A person who confabulates is not trying to deceive anyone. They are sincerely filling a gap in their own memory with something that feels like a fact, and they believe the invented piece completely, because it arrived wearing the costume of a real recollection. The mind does not like blank spaces in its account of the past. It would rather supply a plausible answer than admit it does not know, and it supplies that answer below the level of awareness, so the person never feels the moment of invention. They simply remember, and the remembered thing happens to be partly made up, and there is no internal alarm to tell them which parts. When new information arrives after an event, it can quietly rewrite the memory of the event itself, a process that has been studied for decades and found to be remarkably powerful. A misquote heard 100 times replaces the line spoken once. A meme seen thousands of times replaces the headline shown briefly. A side-by-side comparison shared endlessly online replaces the true order of events with a more satisfying one. The mind does not keep the original safely sealed away while it processes the new information. It updates the memory with each new encounter, blending the fresh material into the old, until the memory reflects mostly the repetitions and very little of the source. Whatever a person meets most often becomes what they remember, regardless of whether it matches what actually happened, because the brain treats frequency as a rough signal of truth. There is also the simple, relentless effect of time. Memory studies have found that even shortly after an event, the details a person can freely recall begin to fall away, and that over the span of years the loss is severe, with much of the original detail simply gone. Into those growing gaps flows everything else: the expectations, the confabulations, the later information, until the memory is more reconstruction than record. A show watched casually in childhood and recalled decades later has had an enormous stretch of time in which to drift, and a great deal of the original detail has long since dissolved, leaving the mind to rebuild the rest from whatever materials are nearest to hand. So the question that haunted the very first case, the puzzle of why the same specific mistake appears in so many separate minds, finally has an answer, and it requires no broken timelines. The same false memories arise in different people because those people share the same machinery, the same expectations, the same culture, and very often the same sources. A whole generation expects a monkey to have a tail. A whole audience encounters the same meme far more often than the original headline. Millions of people see the same misleading side-by-side image and absorb the same false order of events. The errors are not random, so they do not scatter in 1,000 directions. They are shaped by shared expectations and shared exposure. And so they converge, with many separate minds making the very same mistake for the very same ordinary reasons. The collective nature of the false memory is not a sign of anything supernatural. It is a sign that human minds, fed the same inputs, fail in the same patterned ways. It is worth pausing on why so many people reached instead for the dramatic explanation, the parallel universes, and the rewritten timelines, because the reaching itself is revealing. A plain memory error is unflattering. It means a person was simply wrong, that their mind let them down, that the certainty they felt was hollow. A crack in reality is far more comfortable, because it places the fault outside the self. If the world shifted, then the memory was right all along, and the dignity of the memory is preserved. The exciting explanation also carries a kind of wonder, a sense that the universe is stranger and more mysterious than the dull official version of things. Faced with the choice between being ordinary and wrong, or being a witness to something cosmic, many people understandably prefer the cosmic version. The conspiracy is not believed because the evidence supports it. It is believed because it feels better than the alternative. Parallel universes, though, are not needed to explain any of this, and the explanation that remains is in some ways more remarkable than the fantasy. The truth is that every person carries, inside their own skull, a past that is partly invented, edited, and rebuilt without their knowledge or consent. The mind is forever quietly revising the record, filling gaps, absorbing suggestions, smoothing rough edges into cleaner stories, and presenting the whole construction to its owner as faithful memory. No outside force is required to alter the past, because the past is being gently altered all the time, from within, by the ordinary work of an ordinary brain doing its best with limited materials. That is a stranger and more intimate mystery than any shifting timeline, because it does not happen out in the universe somewhere. It happens in each person, every day, beneath the floor of awareness. Why this particular show became the great proving ground for all of this is its own small story, and it comes down to a rare combination of conditions, each one feeding the others. Longevity is the first. A show that runs for more than 3 decades accumulates an immense body of material and an immense span of time in which memories can drift. Volume is the second. Hundreds of episodes, each stuffed with jokes and references and quick background details, create far more raw material to misremember than any short-lived show could ever provide. Density is the third. The frames are packed with tiny gags glimpsed for a fraction of a second, details that were never looked at carefully enough to be remembered correctly in the first place. The manner of watching is the fourth. The show is absorbed loosely, half-watched across countless ordinary afternoons, soaked in while the mind is busy with other things, which produces soft impressions rather than sharp recordings from the very start. Generational reach adds another layer. The show became a shared inheritance, watched by children who grew up and raised children who watched it too, woven so deeply into common life that its lines entered everyday speech and its images became a shared language. A thing that widely shared, that casually known, becomes a natural canvas for collective memory, and therefore for collective false memory. The variable opening sequence sharpens the effect further, combining the deepest familiarity with the greatest variability, so that the most watched footage of all becomes a confident blur, and the genuine removals and edits supply the final ingredient, teaching the audience that the record really can change, which lends a borrowed credibility to every shaky memory and every invented one. Add the internet to that already volatile mixture and the reaction becomes explosive. The same network that lets people share genuine observations also lets them share doctored images, misstated scenes, cherry-picked clips, and confident misquotes, blending the real and the fake into a single stream that no casual viewer can easily sort. Each share strengthens whatever it carries, true or false, because repetition is what memory mistakes for truth. A false memory held by one person is fragile and easily corrected. A false memory held by millions, confirmed by every friend who reposts it, set to eerie music in 100 videos, becomes nearly impossible to dislodge, because doubting it starts to feel like doubting the obvious. The internet did not invent collective false memory, but it built the perfect engine for manufacturing and hardening it at a scale and speed that no earlier era could have imagined. The show provided the rich material, and the network provided the amplifier, and the two together produced a phenomenon far larger than either could have created alone. What all of this finally reveals reaches well beyond one cartoon, and it touches something close to the center of how people live together. A great deal of what any person believes about the past is not drawn from their own direct experience at all. It is inherited, absorbed from others, built from shared stories and shared images and the endless quiet repetition of a culture talking to itself. The shared past, the one held in common by a whole society, is not a fixed archive that everyone consults. It is a living, shifting construction, assembled and reassembled through conversation and repetition, vulnerable to the same drift and the same invention that shape a single person's memory, only multiplied across millions. Collective memory is not a record. It is an ongoing act, performed together, and like any act performed by fallible people, it can go beautifully or badly wrong. A generation raised on this show, and raised at the same time on the internet, became the first to watch its own collective memory glitch in real time, in public, with the evidence available for anyone to check. Earlier generations surely misremembered their shared stories too, but they had no easy way to discover it, no archive to consult, no global conversation in which to compare notes and find the seams. This generation could pull up the original frame, set it beside the false memory, and watch the gap appear with their own eyes. That experience, repeated across thousands of small cases, taught a whole culture something that previous cultures mostly never learned. It taught them that shared certainty is not the same as truth, that a memory can feel completely solid and still be wrong, and that the past everyone agrees on can quietly drift away from the past that actually happened. A cartoon became the place where an entire culture learned to doubt itself, and the doubt, uncomfortable as it is, may be one of the more honest things that culture ever absorbed. There is something gentle to be found at the end of all this, underneath the unease. The softness of memory, the very thing that lets it fail, is also the thing that lets it hold meaning. A perfect recording device would store every event with cold and equal accuracy, the precious moments no brighter than the dull ones. Human memory does something different and more human. It emphasizes, it shapes, it lets feeling carve some moments deep and let others fade, and in doing so it turns a life into a story rather than a ledger. The same machinery that misremembers a couch gag is the machinery that lets a person hold a childhood afternoon in golden light long after the details have blurred. The errors and the meaning come from the same source. To remember like a person, rather than like a machine, is to remember imperfectly, and the imperfection is not only a flaw, it is part of what makes memory feel like ours. Being wrong together, in the end, may be one of the most human things there is. A crowd of strangers sharing the same false memory is, viewed coldly, a failure of accuracy. Viewed warmly, it is a sign of how deeply connected those strangers are, how thoroughly they drank from the same well of stories and images, how completely a single show became a part of all of them at once. The shared mistake is also a shared inheritance. To misremember the same brochure, the same headline, the same scene, is to have grown up in the same world, shaped by the same flickering light in the corner of the same kind of room. The false memory is evidence of a real bond, even when the memory itself is not real. So the long list of glitches, the invented character and the misdated escalator, and the coincidental brochure and the misquoted lines, and the drifting headline, and the impossible couch gags, and the vanished episodes, turns out to be a portrait. Not a portrait of a broken reality, but a portrait of the mind itself, drawn in yellow, made visible because the show was big enough and beloved enough and watched closely enough for everyone to notice the failures happening together. The Simpsons did not predict the future or slip between dimensions. It did something quieter and more profound. It held up a mirror, and the whole culture looked into it, and what looked back was the soft, shifting, reconstructive, deeply human way that every mind remembers and forgets, and gently invents the past it carries. That is where this walk comes to rest. A cartoon family taught millions of people that their memories were never the solid record they believed, that certainty is no guarantee of truth, and that the past, both private and shared, is something built rather than stored. It is an unsettling lesson, but it arrives wrapped in warmth, because the show that delivered it was loved, and the people who learned it together. There are far worse ways to discover the fragility of memory than through a thing that brought so much comfort and so much laughter to so many ordinary evenings. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.